Soviet government used several methods to maintain control over its population, including 1. Mass surveillance. The government used an array of surveillance methods, including secret police, spies, and informants, to keep tabs on the population and identify any signs of dissent or resistance. 2. Political repression. The Soviet Union's government used harsh measures to suppress political opposition and criticism. 3. Propaganda. The Soviet government was heavily reliant on propaganda and used it to shape public opinion and justify its policies. The types of propaganda used by the Soviet Union included 1. Political propaganda. Propaganda promoting the ideology of communism and the Soviet government. The Soviet government used propaganda to justify its policies and promote its agenda. 2. Social propaganda. Propaganda promoting social and cultural values, such as the value of teamwork and self-sacrifice. 3. Military propaganda. Propaganda promoting the military and the Soviet military. The Soviet government used propaganda to motivate support for the military and to justify its defense spending. The Soviet Union tried to justify these methods by arguing that the end goal was to create a better, more equal society. The government also used propaganda to portray the Western powers as imperialist and exploitative, and to portray the Soviet system as superior to capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union often contradicted itself in its policies and goals, which created inconsistencies and problems within the country. For example, the Soviet government claimed to promote equality and equal opportunity for all citizens, but in practice, this often meant that the elite and those close to the government had better access to resources and opportunities than the rest of the population. This contradiction was often the source of social discontent and tension within the Soviet Union. Continuing another example of contradiction in the Soviet Union was the government's commitment to social welfare. The Soviet government claimed to provide generous social welfare programs and provide healthcare for all citizens, but the reality was often different. The healthcare system was often inadequate, and access to quality medical care was often limited, particularly in rural areas. This contradiction between the government's promises and the reality of the healthcare system caused widespread dissatisfaction among the population. Inadequate resources. 2. Political bureaucracy. 3. Lack of corruption. 3. Lack of access to opportunity. Is imperative to little proportionate services. 30. Lack of infrastructure. Inability to address social problems. 17. Inability to provide basic services. The reason people had to stand in long lines to buy food in the Soviet Union was due to a combination of economic and logistical factors. During the Soviet era, the government's central planning system led to frequent shortages of consumer goods and food. The distribution of goods and resources was often inefficient, leading to long lines and shortages of common necessities such as food, clothing, and household. Continuing. The central planning system of the Soviet Union focused on economic efficiency and not on meeting the needs of individuals or consumer needs. This resulted in a lack of incentives to produce enough goods to meet the needs of the population. Additionally, the centralized distribution system was often inefficient, with goods often being diverted or stolen during distribution. This further contributed to the shortages and long lines at stores. Yes, the Soviet Union often refused to trade and accept provisions from other countries, particularly from the Western countries, during the Cold War. The Soviet Union had a policy of self-reliance and a self-sufficient economy, and was often reluctant to accept aid or trade with countries it saw as capitalist or imperialist. This policy was based on the belief that the Soviet Union could meet its own needs without outside help. There's 1. Meat. 2. Fish. 3. Fruits. 4. Fresh vegetables. 5. Dairy products. 6. bread 7, sugar 8, alcoholic drinks 10, hygiene products 12, cleaning products 13, clothes 14, shoes 15, books 17, media 18, electrical appliances 19, vehicles 20, building materials 21, construction equipment 22, heavy machinery 23, Continuing, the impact of these policies on the Soviet population was profound. Many people suffered from malnutrition, and food shortages were common. The lack of variety in food also meant that the Soviet population had less access to balanced diets, contributing to health problems such as anemia, rickets, and other vitamin deficiencies. The shortages also caused social tensions and discontent among the population. People had to wait in long lines for hours to purchase basic necessities, leading to public dissatisfaction. This public discontent also contributed to the eventual fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the Soviet Union, food lines were often managed and controlled by the police and military to maintain order and prevent chaos. The police and military were responsible for ensuring that the lines were organized and that the people in line behaved in an orderly manner. They would also be on hand to prevent any attempts at cutting in line or creating disturbances. The presence of the police and military was also intended to prevent violence and looting among desperate and hungry people. The areas that were most affected by shortages and long food lines in the Soviet Union were typically the rural areas. Rural areas often had less access to food and basic necessities due to their distance from cities and the centralized distribution system. People in rural areas were also often more reliant on locally produced food, which was often impacted by the weather and other natural factors. Urban areas, on the other hand, were often better supplied with goods and food due to their proximity to distribution centres and the government's efforts to prioritize the urban population. Some of the cities and towns that were most affected by food shortages and long food lines in the Soviet Union included Moscow, Leningrad, Baku, Novosibirsk, Tashkent, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, Stalingrad, now Volgograd, Kazan, Rostov-on-Don, Chelyabinsk, Ufa, Ekaterinburg, Nizhny Novgorod, Gorky. Here are some more cities and towns that were affected by food shortages and long food lines in the Soviet Union. Minsk, Riga, Vilnius, Kaunas, Yerevan, Belishebat, Alma-Ata, Tashkent, Dushanbe, Frunze, Grozny, Bakhchisaraya, Kislovodsk, Kumval, Simferopol, Pyatigorsk. People rebelled against the food shortages in various ways in the Soviet Union. Some common forms of rebellion were protests, riots, looting, and black markets. Protests and riots were often the result of people's frustration with the shortages and their lack of access to resources. People would gather in the streets to express their anger and demand access to food and other goods. Looting was also common during continuing times of shortages, as people would break into stores and warehouses in order to obtain food and other goods. Black markets were also common during the Soviet era, as people would trade or exchange goods on the black market in order to get what they needed. These markets were often in secret and outside of government control, and were often used to trade on the shortage of food and other goods. Yes, I can provide some more details and facts about the Soviet Union's food shortages that are not commonly mentioned in the mainstream media. In addition to the lack of food, the Soviet Union also experienced a shortage of basic necessities such as soap, clothing, and other basic household items. The shortage of food was also related to the Soviet Union's centralized economic system and the inefficiencies of the centralized planning system. The food shortages were also a result of the Soviet Union's poor agricultural production, which was often affected by poor weather conditions and poor soil quality. In addition to the food and luxury item shortages, the Soviet Union also experienced a shortage of certain essential and crucial goods, such as medicines and medical equipment. The shortage of these goods was a result of the lack of focus on producing and supplying these items, as well as the government's inefficiency in allocating resources. The shortage of medical supplies also had significant negative impact on the health of the Soviet population. Many people did not receive timely medical treatment or access to necessary medications, which likely contributed to a lower life expectancy in the Soviet Union compared to other industrialized countries.